Hello, good evening. First, of course, I want to thank Carlos and everyone to have invited me, but I wanted to start by saying the fact that I left Paris yesterday and there was a general strike. And it's not to talk about the fact that it was difficult to get to the airport, whatever, but the fact that I hesitated to come because I thought it was much more important to stay in Paris and go to the march and go with, be with a striker and be with them, that we had to show in the street our strength. So it's to say that even though, of course, this conversation and meeting again Ariella and new friends is very important, nonetheless, I cannot do it as if nothing is happening where I live now, which is France, for many reasons. The fact that there is a strike, a general strike, and that the fact that we have been so many in France is very important for me, and I bring it here in that conversation tonight. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's there with me if you want. So I entitled my talk, Welcome to the Great Museum of Colonial Pathology. It does not mean much, but well. And because I wanted to answer the invitation to reflect and discuss about the fact that public institutions such as libraries, museums, and archives consist of a huge amount of plundered material and are organized around imperial structure that facilitate the normalization of this holding in this institution. And the invitation, I quote again, to provide a framework for discussion of transformative potentiality of imperial collection and different modality of undoing its legacy from the following question. What are the modalities of undoing the legacy of intangible memories of looting, dispossession, crime, and violence? 2, how do we distinguish between the object in pre-colonial non-Western museum versus the object in Western museum? And 3, what to do when there is a lack, an absence of object? Because in the West, object means story, no object, no story. And thus, imagining, which I did with some friends years ago, a museum without object. So I will talk about that. But before starting, it must be said that I take into account the current context, the increased militarization of the public space, public violence, attack against public institutions, of which we are talking tonight, the growing privatization of museums, or the integration in the logic of the market and any kind of a cultural institution. Racism and growing ethno-nationalism everywhere, the growing devastation brought by capitalist extractivism, but also the revolt and insurrection worldwide of people against capitalism and extractivism, of women against violence, and the work and artists in this revolt and insurrection. I'm thinking of what is happening today in Iraq, Lebanon, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and India, in which the artists contribute so much to the insurrection or revolt. But I'm also aware of the capacity of capitalism to transform into object and merchandise even the critique, which is directed at it. The speed with which museums of academic, at least in France, but I know also later in Germany, have appropriated the notion of decolonization and decolonial gave me pause. It's as if we barely uttered a word and we see it right away transform into a brand. It's on a T-shirt and it can be bought anywhere. So we confronted this question in the collective Decolonize the Art, of which I am a co-founder, and ask ourselves, did we need to maroon again to do the enslaved people who escaped the plantation? Is the world a plantation? And should we escape from the plantation? Should we build somewhere else? Can we, otherwise, is not effective the plantation everywhere, the logic of the plantation? Do we need to create more form of fugitivity? Even if we look at about a looted object, and we look at the French case, and we know that the French looted a lot of objects. On the one hand, of course, the promise has been made to return a bunch of them, but on the other, nothing has been done. Institutions are still headed by white men. Some of us are censored in the museum, but mostly the French politics in Africa remain the same, imperialist politics. So how do we connect these things? Next year in France, there will be the Season of Africa, which was announced 2 years ago by President Macron. And Gonefort, the Senegalese curator, has been put in charge of the program. It should be the perfect moment to push for restitution and reparation. And we could imagine, in fact, that all the migrants who live in camp in the street of France or everywhere, in Paris and everywhere, should be the first to be the recipient of this object, because this object comes the country from which they are. They could be effectively those with whom we discuss the return and restitution and reparation, and not expert. We had a discussion in our collective what to do with this Season of Africa. Should we go to it? Should we organize a counter season? We did not all agree. Some wanted to participate. But finally, we decided that it was more important to develop and protect our space. We do not trust the government. We do not trust the institution. And though imagining modality of reparation and restitution is at the heart of our project of decolonizing art, we know that we must first decolonize ourselves, our gaze, our mind. As Steve Biko has said, the greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of those whom they oppress. So we work towards an anti-racist politics of reparation that look at all the entanglement that imperialism and capitalism produce. This fall in the university Decolonizing the Art, which we organize at La Colonie, we try to imagine what could be our own Decolonial Museum. And what emerged was the force and domination of the colonial liberal discourse, as if we could not escape its frame. We spend more time discussing how to add voice in the museum, how to give context, than to imagine something really different. I do not say new because I agree with what Ariela Azoulay, Ariela has developed in her last book of the critique of that term, which relate more to what I will say, how to change, so nothing changed, than really anything new. So this is, our focus, to decolonize our mind. We are caught, but we are caught also in multiple temporality of reparation at the same time. We need to repair the past that is barely repaired, that started barely to be repaired. We need to repair the present as it's being developed, and as we see inequality growing, more violence growing. And we need also to repair already the future that is already, whose consequences are already there, and that is a future which is both our past, our present, and a future that we don't know yet. So this code between multiple temporality of reparation and restitution is a very difficult task, because effectively we are confronted with a regime which knows only the linear, trajectory. In Europe, at least in France, we can say that people are slowly getting what Aimé Césaire called the Boomerang Effect of colonialism and imperialism. The fact that the logic of racial laws and racial practices inevitably come back to the colonial metropole and insinuate itself even in more progressive ideology. And he followed that in his letter of resignation for the Communist Party, the French Communist Party in 1956, showing that even an ideology like the communist ideology has been, contaminated by racism. And we know that, for instance, you did have anti-slavery and anti-colonial people, and yet they were racist and sexist. You could be against slavery, abolitionist, and be racist. Or you could be against colonialism and be racist and sexist. We know that you have a feminism which is racist, and leftists who are sexist. So what do we know? We are there now, I think, in that stage of the long process of decolonization, because for me, decolonization is not that moment, historical moment that we talk about. That was independence, effectively getting back the land that has been taken by the colonizer. But it's one step along in the long process of decolonization, and this is again emancipating ourselves from mental slavery. So I would like to present in that spirit some experimentation of decolonial methodology I imagine and put to practice, both individually and also with Decolonize the Art. The first one was The Slave in the Louvre and Invisible in Humanity, which I did for the Triennale 2012 Triennale with Okwe Vezo as a curator. And it was because I heard a lot when I was talking in France that my ancestor had nothing to do with the slave trade and slavery. So we are very sorry, but we had nothing to do. with that. So my point was like, how can I show them that they had something to do with it? And it was not by giving fact and dates, because they will tell me, oh, we are sorry, that was very bad. So then I thought about it, and it was to go to the Louvre and identify the first painting in European art, when the first time you see men smoking a pipe. That when tobacco entered into the representation of bourgeois masculinity of oneself. Because in 16th, 17th century, you don't see men smoking, suddenly, early 17th, but mid-17th century, you start to see them. You start to see a lot of painting with men and bourgeois men. But you see also, in the popular gathering. So the fact that tobacco has entered really like the social, way of being, and also being associated with masculinity, which was nothing natural. There was no reason that tobacco was associated with masculinity. But the fact that becoming a man meant smoking. So from there, going in front of that painting, and first, of course, explaining who was a painter, but also then taking all the thread from the tobacco, from the pipe, and talking about tobacco, then of slavery, then the fact how it came to Europe, how it entered, and why it slowly became associated with masculinity, and the question of representation. And the same thing was to do with, for instance, painting in which you started to see teapot, or coffee pot, or a sugar bowl that you will not have seen before. Right? And it was the same thing sometimes with furniture, when you start to see exotic woods and ebony or whatever, and incredible, or you see ivory in the furniture, and this means that Europe is in contact already with other part of the world and already looting and entering the representation of what is Europe, and being appropriated and becoming European art or European design. So that was one thing to do that. So your ancestor was not a slave trader, was not a slave owner, but smoked tobacco, put sugar in his coffee, and had cotton and chocolate. So that was the way to show the complexity in which, what slavery built, the fact we were caught into this entanglement, and of course, the connection we can make with today. The second thing was to do at the Musée de la Croix. It was beyond Orientalism. And it started with of course, the work by Edouard Said, but it was not so much about de la Croix. It was to start, so there was a room around women and Orientalism, the Oriental woman, the Oriental man, and the Oriental woman was woman Verges in the apartment, the famous painting. And the one about men was about Sardar Napal, so the man, the Oriental man, in his bed looking at people being killed, and so many women around him, of course, this kind of image. But it was not so much to talk about de la Croix. It was to talk to people today. Do they like Oriental food? Do they go to Oriental dance? Do they take Oriental dance classes? And to tell them that does not exist. That how it has become so much, has entered so much that they could say, oh, that was a colonial imagery. And they could be critical about that. But nonetheless, themselves knew that there was an Orient. So it was the kind of deconstruction. And we had, I found a woman who also showed that how in music it changed in 19th century. How, a musician learned to gave an Oriental note to music. So and she made the demonstration, and you heard, and how then it was like as if, some Arab men arriving on their horse, you were hearing that. And it was very interesting to show that. So it was, again, how this has penetrated, and we did something about Orientalism in TV series and Homeland and everything, but also in film. So it's always for me to start from today and show how this has penetrated our culture and the way that we don't see anymore. So how to decolonize our gaze. And another one was what I call l'atelier, the workshop. I call it l'atelier to really base on the fact that in a workshop you work collectively. You work also by imitation. You learn to become a mechanic, or you learn to weave by looking how someone who knows is doing it. And you make some mistake, but you learn slowly. So it was a different way of learning and teaching that in the school. It was, like allowing for mistake, allowing and being much more horizontal than top down. So that was the idea. And so I did 4 editions. The last one was in 2018, and I will talk about that last one. It was called War, Peace, and Water. And water, because it was started, giving water was starting to be criminalized. If you give water to a migrant, you could be, associated as being a smuggler in France. So this gesture, which is really a human gesture, right? To give water to someone is really the basic things, right? This is not nothing elaborate. This was criminalized. And I thought this is so important that, giving a glass of water has become criminalized, that something has to do with the water. And of course, it went also with the fact that the Mediterranean has become a cemetery, with the fact of the war against water, the privatization of water, that more and more we need to drink water in, plastic bottle. We cannot take water from the tap. So all this, how water, which is absolutely essential for human beings. Without water, we die much more quickly than if we don't eat, for instance. It's very quick. So all this and how water has entered, absolutely, of course, the privatization, but also the fact that it has been criminalized. And the fact that then war, as a war, peace, and water, because all the war around water, and giving water is some kind of offering of peace. And the fact that also working on war and peace, the fact that war is become normalized, totally normalized, and peace is really like a small moment between 2 wars, right? That has to be discussed, negotiated between a lot of men around a table, whatever. And so peace is never about peacefulness, like how to have a peaceful life, like not a life effectively based on aggressivity. So that was the starting point, so I gave a lot of text, and I did it with like 25 artists, young artists of color. And so how war and violence have been naturalized, how murder in the norm, the military conception of peace, and how peace becomes the stuff of dreamers, who do not understand human nature, So, all this. So we had 3 groups. One was a Cassandra, who, of course, were warning everyone that things were going to be bad, and, of course, nobody wanted to listen to them. Another group was a migrant, the keepers of water, and they were the ones who were, like effectively chased, had to be in exile, walking everywhere, but they were the keepers of water. And the last group was the Amazon, the one who thought that there is war, we have to learn to fight, we have to become warriors also. There was, we have to learn, all the Fanon theory of violence. And these 3 groups worked by themselves. They were not saying to the other what they were doing. So we had 2 days. So the other principle is like it's in 2 days. The second day we open it to the public. It's a public performance. It has to be the lowest economy possible. Like if we try not to buy anything. So if we need something, do you have it at home? We don't have it. Okay, how can we replace it? So it has to be really working with the lowest economy. That's one principle. So as I say, so it was today. We started by, we went to the cemetery of Père-Lachaise in front of the Mur des Fédérés, when so many communards were assassinated by the Versailles during the Paris Commune, as a place, because war, but you have dead people, so you have to mourn. You have to pay, homage to those who died. So not only the communards, but everyone in the colonial war. So we had a ceremony also. We do ceremonies with rum and everything. We do it seriously. It's not just, we don't bring flowers like a government doing, but we did really with some songs. Then we walk through Paris, and we went also to the river afterwards. And the river, because there, in La Seine, the French police has thrown Algerians in 1961, and 100 of them died, were drowned there. So it was also water in this complicated situation. And then the second day we had this performance, and in fact we worked together. It was to try to see if the 3 groups could work together by saying, okay, I'm going to need that corner, and I'm going to go through that room at that point, and okay, fine. And if we could work together like that, if there would be a possibility without repetition, and we did. And that was, it was quite strong. So that has been that. And then also another things I did, it was more recently a performance called Haitian Revolutionaries Invite Themselves to Joséphine and Napoleon home. There was a museum called the Musée de Malmaison where Joséphine de Beauharnais and Napoleon Bonaparte lived for a while. And there is a very important painting by David showing Bonaparte going, over the Alps, going to Italy. This is like the conquering young officer. And on the other side is by Kendi Wiley, the same, exactly the same, but it's an African American over, on a horse. So the two paintings are there, and I was invited to do something. And I say to the people at the museum, well, for me, Napoleon is one thing, the fact that he brought back slavery. Slavery had been abolished in France in 1794. He restored slavery in 1802. And so it had to be abolished again in 1848. So for me, Napoleon, that the rest, I don't care. So, and then because of that, you had the insurrection in Guadeloupe that he crushed completely, like thousands of people died, and the slaves who were not killed were sent to the United States and to other parts, to the other island. And there was, of course, the revolution in Haiti, which had already started since 1791, and Napoleon sending his troops. And he was defeated by the Haitian. And this defeat of Napoleon is never talked about. It's Waterloo, but it's never talked about. And this was the first defeat, of the. So all this, I put together a text by Toussaint Louverture from his prison in Jura, but also text, testimony, the decree of restoring slavery. So people will hear things, like all this. And so we walk through the museum with music and tell all this story. We did. The only word by Napoleon was just his decree. And the fact that the decree was also with racial laws, because in France, people tell you there have never been racial laws. Only the United States do that, right? And in fact, in 1802, the decree was followed by law forbidding marriage between black and white, and also the presence of black people in France. You have the decree, right? And they could be arrested and expelled. So we did that. But one of the things also, I'm going to finish on this example. The first time I visited the museum, I noticed the room where Napoleon died in Sainte-Hélène, the island of Sainte-Hélène. They had Chinese furniture. And so I was surprised. I said, Napoleon was interested in Chinese furniture. He brought that with him. And they said, no, he bought them in Sainte-Hélène. I said, well, why did we have, Sainte-Hélène is a small island lost in the Atlantic. Like you had a shop with the Chinese furniture? No, they said they were Chinese in Sainte-Hélène. I said, they were Chinese in Sainte-Hélène in the 19th century? Why? Oh, they said, we never asked ourselves that question. Okay. So I went, and of course I looked for it. And what was interesting, when Napoleon arrived, when the English brought him there, you had only 90 white there on the island, 300 black people enslaved, and 900 Chinese. And I was delighted to think that Napoleon, who was so racist, arrived in a society, in a place where the majority of people were not white, And imagining that, that it's the stuff of a novel, of a movie. And the fact that of the lack of curiosity of the curators of the museum. And this has been for years. The museum has opened for decades. And they never ask themselves, why do we have, Chinese furniture? So this is also the kind of thing, not just the object, what the object also tell us, how we pull thread. And so with the Chinese, the question of migration in 19th century, post-slavery form of migration imposed by the imperialists. So these are some of the modality of imagining. Okay, now I'm going to go faster. I wanted to talk also about now more things I'm working on, and I don't have really the answer. But although by looking at what Ariel has done about rape in a show, gave me some idea. But the point is, how do we, what do we do with what I call slow violence? not the immediate, brutal, visible violence of war, but the slow violence, the fact that when the consequence of the crime, of brutality, linger long after the crime, whether they are disease of the soul, depression, sadness, melancholia, or of the body, cancer, leukemia, malformation, right? And I was thinking of the consequence of nuclear tests French nuclear tests in Algeria, or in the French island of Pacific, the consequence of the pollution in Martinique and Guadeloupe today, by the pesticide which has been forbidden in France, but which the French state continue to allow in this island because they remain colonial territory, but also about the rape of so many Algerian women by French soldiers during the colonial war. Rape was denounced in 2 or 3 trials, of Algerian nationalists, but it never became a central issue. And we never learned about the rape of men, of Algerian men. Only one French soldier, Benoit, wrote about the systematic rape by French soldiers. He showed that rape, he talked about what rape had done to the French soldier, but never about, we never hear about the woman. And yet his testimony reveals something about, that. He say, and I quote, "We were beasts commanded by bastards." He was 20-year-old when he was sent to Algeria in 1959. Every night he wrote notes about what he witnessed and gave his note to a trusted fellow who took them back to France because there was a lot of censorship. He remembered officers telling soldiers before they enter a village, an Algerian village, "You can rape, but do it a little discreetly," and added, "That's pacification. Anyway, Arabs are only good to be killed." His first night in his unit, he learned that a 15-year-old Muslim girl had been raped by 7 soldiers and a 13-year-old Muslim girl by 3 soldiers. Rape was made into a banal weapon against Algerian women and men. It had to be done without much thought. When Ray returned to France, he felt, I quote, "physically empty, with an incurable wound to the heart." He gathered his note and wrote a book in 2 months called Les Égorgeurs in France, the murderers, the butchers, published in 1961 by Édition de Minuit, which with Maspero Edition was, publishing a lot of books of protest during the Algerian War. The book was right away, of course, says at the printer, was never shown. But beside rape, Ray denounced also what was another banal, act of the French army. And he was a direct witness of the slaying by French soldiers of more than 100 Algerian men who were forced to be on their knees and with their hand tied with their back and had their throat, slain. His testimony belied colonial propaganda, which has created the image of the barbarous Felaga slaying innocent young white soldiers. The image of the Arabs with a knife between their teeth hark back to anti-communist propaganda of 1919 in France, when we saw the Bolshevik with a knife between his teeth. But this one of the Arab with a knife became a familiar trope during the war, playing into Orientalist cliché and into a Western construction of Arab masculinity, violent, murderous, deceitful. A year ago, in fact, French police forced 151 very young adolescents, black and Arab, to be on their knees with their hand behind their head near Paris. They stayed like that, they were forced to stay like that for hours, and none of the police officers was punished. So the afterlives of colonial war and racism can be read in this mise-en-scène where white masculinity exhibits its power over non-white masculinity. So where are the modalities of reparation? Are there things that cannot be repaired? In a 2004 conversation, Aimé Césaire said that he did not want any reparation for colonial slavery. He wanted the wound to remain open, the scar to be kept visible, until the West would have fully understood what it had done. The West could understand, finally, say, financial compensation. It could accept to give a monetary value to something. But he will forget about the crime he had committed. Repair, Césaire said, will come once the West will no longer be the West. Could thus we say that the full reparation for the rape of women of color because of racism, colonialism, and imperialism will be possible only when racism and imperialism will be defeated. Rape had contributed to the accumulation of capital under slavery. Enslaved women were raped for social reproduction. The womb of our black women were made into capital, and black women were raped to give birth to objects of commerce. Rape has always been a weapon of war, it's true, but colonial war made it a systematic weapon of depossession and destruction. It was also to destroy families and communities. And we know that slavery and colonialism, in fact, do some unchilding, forbid children to be children fully, and also forbid family to be constituted. Under slavery, there was no family, right? The father was forbidden to be a father, the mother, the child could be taken away, and children were never children. As soon as they could walk, they were put in the plantation. So this is also the way for me that how do we discuss the fact also of this lingering, form, the fact that as much as we talk about the protection of children, the innocence of children, that children have to be protected in the West, the more some other children are no longer children, are forbidden to become children. Childhood is a privilege, and it belongs to some people only. There are a lot of people have never known childhood, even today, of course. So that's, for me, how do we talk about, or the will to humiliate, to take away human dignity, to denigrate, to abase, and to erase, which is at the heart of the colonial regime, past and present, and how it's always there as a ghostly presence in all the European Museum collection. Do I have still 5 minutes? Or sure? Yeah? Okay. So I wanted to talk about the object in pre-colonial non-Western museum, but perhaps I don't have time. It's just to say that the idea that, pre-colonial Western civilization had no museum is false. They did. So I was interested in about the object in this collection, the status versus the status of the object that Ariella told so well about and is in her show. Because, for instance, if you think about in the Ashanti Kingdom in 1822, the ruler built a museum, which was called Aban, the House of Stone, in which he had objects. He had a collection, he collected objects, Persian rugs, I think glass from Moorish craft, Bohemian glass, a large piece of rock gold, swords, glass tumblers, Ashanti handicraft and craft. I mean, really. And European travelers who went there left, admiring account of the collection. But in February 1874, the British Army entered the capital, which was Kumasi was as big as London at the time, and they ordered the looting and burning of the city, the looting of the museum, and the total destruction of the museum, to the extent that even today, until now, it's very difficult to localize the building. Archaeologists cannot even find. So I was, the question of collecting not being a Western invention, and the different then, relation between the object of collection and the looted object. The fact that you did have rulers, of course, it was, of course, a sign of power and wealth. It was not, for the people, but nonetheless, this idea. So, and how then to erase that? It means that, very few people most people will say they never were a museum in the pre-colonial world. The idea that the museum is really just a European invention. I think it's a colonial museum which is a European invention. The museum which assert the superiority of a civilization over the one which really produced a vocabulary, a racist, sexist vocabulary, everything that also was shown before by Ariella, and also, of course, in her exhibition. So I had something about the question of lack, how lack is central, that the absence, the notion of absence is central to this idea of different civilization, right? And the European civilization have an idea of what is the plenty, how to fill the absence, and the other will be lacking something. And how those who are marked by lack, as all are said, to miss something that patriarchy and colonialism could perhaps give them, but of course, they have to force to try or to die, but in fact, they will never reach that. And this notion of lack and absence, it's also at one of the foundations of the discourse of development, which has been so destructive. But anyway, So the notion of lack, I say, assert that Europeans had a natural ability to overcome absence and lack, to march towards progress, and consequently to get access to a world of plenty that will inevitably lead to happiness and a sense of fulfillment, to satisfy and accomplish existence. There is no place for incompleteness, for the unforeseen, for any acceptance of absence in that logic. The future means being able to fill a gap which had to do with mastering the world, whose vastness and complexity are a source of anxiety for Europe. Lack has no place in this idea of progress. It represents a failure of character. Colonization, therefore, is only natural. It's part of the life impulse. It's a necessity, you know. And leaving the world empty exposed, you know, the Western capital to a void that could not be accepted, you know. And we can think, of course, of the theory of terra nullius, you know, that also there was emptiness and we should go. The colonizer mission was to occupy every corner of the world, to leave no place empty, to index and name everything, to fill the European Museum with all that had been robbed, expropriated, and taken. Nature also was plentiful and made cheap. Nature was conceived as limitless, always replenishing itself, a bounty of resources, tree, animal, plant, fish, flowers, people, human, to exploit for the happiness of a few. Cheap nature went hand in hand with cheap labor, human made into object to traffic, sell, buy, kill, abuse. To exploit cheap nature, European organized cheap labor, mobile, sexualized, gender, and racialized. Settlers adopted a vision fed by hubris and belief in racial superiority. They believed in the promise of plenty. They transformed the land into a garden. They tamed the wilderness. They brought order and harmony, where for them chaos and savagery dominated. They grabbed every object they could put their hand on. They appropriated every technique and knowledge they could observe, making them theirs. Greed and avarice were the intimate companion, and of contempt of ignorance. And this remained the logic of capitalism. Capitalism needs colonization. Colonization we are not done with colonization. Nothing must escape its will and its gaze. Which leads me to my last point, which I try to go fast. It's this idea of museum without object, right? So this is, it was a museum that should have been built on Réunion Island, you know, of which I'm from. And so I work with that with a decolonial poet and scholar from the island who's a friend. His name is Karpana Marimutu. And we noticed during seminar organized in 2000-2001 with artists, association, and researchers of Réunion, the strength of the conception of the island history divided into ethno-cultural chapter, which was absolutely, you know, the mirroring of the French narrative. Black arrived, Indian arrived, Chinese arrived, white arrived, right? The participant imagined a succession of houses, the House of Africa, the House of India, the House of China, the Creole House. The narrative was one of the linear progress from slavery to integration within the French Republic. There was much talk about identity and safeguarding tradition. We measure the hegemony of the French policies of assimilation and how effectively even the time was mirroring French time. Okay, First Republic over there, what's happening there? What's happening there? What's happening there? World War II, what's happening there? How to emancipate the island history from the temporality and spatiality imposed by French colonialism was our question. We suggested to start it from the fact, you know, that in fact we were in the Indian Ocean, so we were in Africa, Asian space. And so our time and space was the Indian Ocean space, which has been, you know, a space of encounter between Asia and Africa for centuries before the European arrived. So we were, in fact, made by Africa and Asia and not by Europe. Europe arrived quite late in that part of the world. I mean, you find, you know, China, porcelain in Kilwa, you find, I mean, this was, you know, and they connected with India, which was connected with China, and then, you know, even in Africa, from the coast, east coast to the west coast. I mean, this was a huge, you know, space of circulation and exchange of ideas, of taste, of religion, of, you know, of really and work and scholarship. So it was not an empty space. So we say we belong to that space. And also, we say the history of culture of the vanquished and the oppressed are rarely embodied into material object. They bequeath words rather than palace, hope rather than private property, word, text, and music rather than monument. They leave heritage embodied in people rather than in stone. Song, words, poem, declaration, text often constitute the archive on which to evoke their past. It is a word of the intangible, of the unexpected, of what has been untimely, sorrowful, hopeful. And in Réunion, few objects have survived that would have testified for the life of women and men brought to the island into slavery since 1603. Official history did not record their lives. To recover this past, we had first to acknowledge an absence, an unknown past. Réunion history was a history of the unexpected, of the intangible, of sorrows and struggle. The museum without object would not have been a virtual museum or museum image of sound, but a museum where the object would be an element of other, when it do not need to be authentic, where the absence of material object to visualize the life of the oppressed, the migrant, the marginal, will be confronted, not as a lack, but another form of presence. The idea was not to seek to fill up a void, to compensate for an absence, but to work from the absence, to fully embrace it, for we understood that this absence was paradoxically affirming a presence. To us, the accumulation of objects to celebrate the wealth of a nation belonged to an economy of predation, looting defeated people or exploiting the riches of others. It belonged to an economy of consumption that invested the object with narcissistic meaning, making visible one's identity and social status. Our goal was not to set off searching for lost origin, trying to restore an authenticity, to defend the nostalgia that things used to be better. Nothing in our heritage, no matter how painful they were, gave us the right to claim a moral superiority. What should we preserve? How? Why? Confronted with heritage, one has often the impulse to preserve, reassert, defend, preserve from forgetfulness, from denial, from the policy of silence and amnesia set up by the authority who seek to impose one story, one tradition. Reassert what happened. Defend heritage because they gave rise to story, myth, because they constitute landmarks that we need. But we also need to choose, because everything is not worth being preserved, because we have to preserve and reassert, but without melancholy, without nostalgia. We have to reinterpret our heritage, subject them to a critical appraisal, so that something new can happen, that is, history. We do not have to be victim of our heritage, but reclaim it from a critical position to be able to pass it on. We have to give meaning to our heritage, to be active, because, to quote René Char, no testament precedes our heritage. Hence, rather than looking for the lost object, trying to fill a gap, we're starting with the following challenge. If there are no objects, how do we imagine a museum without object? Starting from an absence and a trace left us to revise the notion of the object and then imagine integrating what exists, the memory, its reconstruction. The object was treated as a trace, whose meaning emerged from escape, social, literary, imaginary, musical, techno, and landscape. We were not partisans of the sacralization of the object as the authentic marker of human action. We thought that violence and resistance, passion and interest had also to be shown through sound, image, play, narrative. The object would be a tool among others, but it did not have to be authentic. When the Portuguese entered the Indian Ocean in 1492, they brought with them the violence of years of intense and brutal religion war in Europe. Negotiation was not an option. People were construed as the enemy. They had to be crushed, massacred, destroyed. The Portuguese imposed a monopoly on trade in an ocean where free merchant capitalism had been the rule. How could we show that moment? The object was not the only reference. We work from an installation of sound, image, object to evoke a moment. We show the past as a metaphor of exile, that crossroad of trade and empire. It evoked the trail of the Maroon and their resistance, the appropriation of the territory by fishermen, farmland trades, the market woman, the vagabond. This space and trail outline another cartography, another archive. The past drew the ancestral course, the one leading from her to us and the one leading us back to her. The display of the itinerary of person, object, rites, ritual, culinary practice, recipes, sound show the route of the multiple level of culture. Reality is polymorphomic, formed by multiple identity and constant metamorphosis. From the place of origin where the ancestor came to the world she contributed to build and bequeath to earth, the itinerary. So perhaps I should, So the last paragraph. We were wary of a narrative that situates slavery and post-colonial status in a foreclosed past, ignoring its contemporary traces. The narrative of linear progress, containing the abstract rhetoric of human rights that had prevailed in the discourse of French abolitionism and paternalistic republicanism, was cutting réunion from the history of regional emancipation, from the circulation of revolutionary ideas in the Indian Ocean, the anti-apartheid struggle, the Mozambican struggle for liberation, the Indian struggle for independence, the Somali struggle, the Sudan struggle, the Egyptian struggle, all this struggle around the people of Chagos Island being exiled to install the biggest military US military base, maritime base in an ocean. All that was, by looking at the way in which Réunion had been a land on the map of predatory economy, the island history was no longer contained with the narrow borders of French national narrative. A cartography of South-South struggle, circulation, migration, and movement of goods, ID belief, would inscribe the island within complex network. Further, a reflection of predatory economy would lead to an exploration of the culture of terror and the rhetoric of protection for barbarism that seek to humanize, which cannot be humanized. When predatory economies set up the rule of protection, they are put in place to enforce submission. The protégé always lives by the rule imposed by its protector. The protégé must then insist on his victimization and body powerlessness. This is not what we wanted. We wanted emancipation and liberation. Thank you.